Today's Bible story can be found in any of the Gospels, any of the books about Jesus that are in the Bible. So Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, the ones that tell his life story. So you can find it for yourself. I put the references up on the screen, so maybe you could note those down and read them later on would be good. But first of all, let's get back in time. It started on what seemed to be a pretty normal day. You see, Jesus and his friends were out travelling towards the city. They'd set off as usual and they were doing what they usually did, walking along and chatting together. When Jesus stopped and he overlooked the city, he looked out at what was to come. Jesus knew what was going to happen in a week's time. He knew how radically the world was about to change and who wanted to kill him. But Jesus was not scared or intimidated. You see, Jesus was completely aware of everything. He turned to two of his disciples and said, "You two, go down into the next village, and there you will find a donkey tied up. If anyone says to you, 'What are you doing with that donkey?' tell them, 'The Lord needs it.' Then bring it back here to me." So the two disciples set off just as Jesus commanded them to. They probably didn't understand why they were going there or what it was all about. But what they had learned in their time with him was when Jesus said something, it was worth listening to. And it was definitely worth following his commands, because amazing things happened when they did. So off they went down to the village. And just like Jesus said, there was indeed a donkey there. Now this donkey was tied up. So just as Jesus said, the two disciples began to untie it. And as they were doing so, they were just about to lead it away when someone came out and said, "Hey you, what are you doing with my donkey?" The disciples remembered what Jesus had said and they turned round and said, The Lord needs it." "That's all right then," said the person whose donkey it was. And the disciples led the donkey all the way back to Jesus. When they got there, Jesus climbed on. Now this donkey had never ever been ridden on before. Jesus climbed on and began to ride down into the city. And as they went down and down the hill, the disciples, they started talking to each other. And they were talking about the amazing things that Jesus had done. Maybe it started like this. "Hey, do you remember when Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead? That was an amazing day, wasn't it? Do you remember the day he broke the bread and there was enough for 5,000 men and their wives and their children?" Maybe one of them said, "Hey, do you remember when we were at that wedding before we really knew him and he turned the water into wine? Can you remember that day he walked on the water? That was incredible." Maybe one of them said, "Hey, do you remember that day on the boat where it was a really bad storm and he was asleep and we woke him up and he went, 'Peace, be still,' and the storm stopped?" And they began talking about the miracles of Jesus and what he'd done and the amazing things that they'd experienced. And as they got into the city, a crowd was there. You see, the city was lined with palm trees. And as they went into the city, the disciples by now got really excited thinking about all the things that Jesus had done. And they were like, "Woohoo for Jesus! Here comes Jesus! Wow, Jesus is incredible!" And as they celebrated, the crowd began to join in. They pulled branches off the trees and began to wave them in the air, and all the people in the city began to cheer. They cheered and shouted, and they were shouting things like, "Hosanna!
Hosanna!
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 Hosanna! Hosanna! Hosanna to the King!
Blessed is the King!
Blessed be the King who comes in the name of the Lord." And things like,
"Peace in heaven.
Glory in the highest.
Glory in the highest.
"Glory to God in the highest and peace on earth to all men." People didn't really understand what they were shouting or really who this was, but they were excited by what they saw and were experiencing. Jesus the King riding in, not in a beautiful crown, but on a donkey. Jesus continued to ride and the crowd got louder and louder and louder. They began throwing their cloaks on the floor in front of him and the donkey trampled over him. They began cheering, "Jesus!" and they began shouting, "Hosanna! Hosanna!
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 Even louder, "Hosanna! Hosanna! Hosanna! Blessed be the King who comes!" people shouted from the crowd. The Pharisees were not at all impressed. "What is he doing? They shook their heads. They tuttered as loud as they could. And they said, who does he think he is? How dare people call him a king? He's not our king. And they began to plot to get rid of him. We need to get rid of him. Ha 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 ha. Their plot grew and grew, and before long they thought they'd been successful. But me and you know, they weren't after all. The people celebrated Jesus and waved their palm leaves and praised him. But the Pharisees, the rulers, the chief priests were appalled. They didn't want Jesus as their king. This Jesus who'd done all that good, why would they want him as their king? Jesus, his journey came to an end in Jerusalem that day, and he got off the donkey and went to celebrate a meal with his friends, as was the custom. But that day was an incredibly special day when a multitude joined together to praise the amazing Jesus.